Well, firstly, I must say some prefatory remarks. That piece was written by me at the time of the Freud Wars, which still continue. And the Freud Wars were an attempt to deprive Freud of any effect on the modern world, but to treat him as if he was still alive. And I was struck because Freud has been dead for quite a long time. And he's treated by his critics in particular as more alive than dead. And I wanted to enter into the spirit of this debate about Freud by bringing Freud back from the dead. Is a particular gift that historians are supposed to have, the gift of imaginatively reviving the dead. We let them go back to their resting places after the process is over. And so I wrote up an interview with Freud, which was situated in this room in London, in Hampstead, and he gave me some very interesting responses. Now, my impression of him, well, he was a ghost, and ghosts don't actually have a straightforward material reality. So, you know, he didn't look any different from the photographs, which we're all familiar with. There was a kind of combination of all the photographs. And he spoke in this terse, precise way, as in the recordings we have, which were also made in this room in 1938 by the BBC, in German and in English. And he spoke this peculiar, precise, archaic English, imagining and using rather beautiful words, slightly imprecisely, and then slightly too precisely. And amongst the things he talked about were, because of the questions that I put to him, were the fact that he was always associated with sex, and that this was the first of his many crimes, that he thought that human beings thought too much about sex, that they were driven too much by sex. And he said, but look at your society. Isn't this the living proof of what I said back in 1900, that was so shocking then, but is so banal now? Everyone is driven by sex, from the medical apparatus that has congregated around reproduction, artificial means of reproduction, to the defining of social groups through their sexual orientation, through their sexual identity. The personal is the political. This is a formula which you'll find from feminism, but it's just psychoanalysis turned upside down, because that was what Freud was himself doing, was showing that if you want to look in any sphere of ordinary life, from the economic to the official to the legal, you'll find the personal embedded in a secret way within that, and having an unexpected but great influence upon all those other forms of activity and all those other discourses. So that was one aspect which he said, you know, the aspect of sex, which I'm accused of, I've always been accused of, is now a banality. And we don't have to talk about that anymore. So the fact that I was sleazy once means I'm now just boring. What else did he talk about? As a pharaoh? Well, interestingly enough, if there's one figure who was deeply problematic and deeply fascinating for Freud, it was Moses. And his final book was to show that Moses was an Egyptian and not a Jew. And why? Well, he wanted to say the invention of monotheism, which the Jews were always associated with, was a great world historical event. But in fact, it was an event of the Egyptian pharaonic culture, Akhenaton, was the great inventor of monotheism. And Moses was Akhenaton's follower, who took the children of Israel as a kind of experimental group to disseminate monotheism once it had failed in Egypt. Now, this peculiar character of Moses, the Egyptian, who was a kind of pharaoh and also a leader of a wild people in the wilderness, this figure was one that Freud identified closely with. And it captures quite a lot of his interesting features as a personality. He was a wild figure in the wilderness. And yet he was an immensely authoritative, an immensely dictatorial at times person. Not dictatorial in the sense that he exerted absolute power over anyone, because he didn't. He had no power. But as a human being, he had immense power in his relationship with patients, in his relationship with his followers. Followers, how do we call them? Disciples, or colleagues, or friends, or students, all these things. But he had that dictatorial relationship to them at times. But the dictatorial quality was his certainty. This was a man whose doubts were always interrogated internally, but then he had certainty. And that's one of the features of Freud that is so striking, is that all his writings are full of this interrogation and self-questioning, but in a tone of absolute certainty. You have a kind of curious contradiction there. And that's one of the reasons why he's such a fascinating writer to read. So that's one of the reasons why he can be seen as a pharaonic or an archaic figure, you might say. I didn't ask him, but I can guess what he might have answered. His answer was that America was a hopeful country, a new country. Beyond the dollar, they believed in a bright new future. And Freud, as an old European, already he was in his 50s when he went to America, was not bringing a hopeful message. There was no salvation in Freud's message. His message was always going to be bad news for humanity. And he thought that that was something toxic for the United States. It would catch on like a plague, and it did. His prediction was true. It caught on like a plague in the United States. But it's been bitterly repudiated as well because it's so un-American. And that's what he meant by saying that he was bringing them the plague, that it was something that was alien to America. Now, whether it was alien to Europe as well, or more acceptable in Europe, but still alien, that's another question, because there is a question that, if there are some movements that bring good news, I think psychoanalysis is a movement that always brought bad news and would not be acceptable, would always be fought against, to the point where people think that Freud is still alive and needs fighting. He had many criticisms of America. He did say it was a terrible mistake, America. From the point of view of who exactly? Maybe culturally. But his principal dislike of what happened to psychoanalysis in America was to do with two things. Well, three things, actually, I would say. Three things. The overwhelming predominance of money as a factor in social and individual relations. The fact of Puritanism, which would mean that psychoanalysis would always be perverted and distorted by the Puritan response to it in America. Oh, and the third thing that he disliked so much about America was that psychoanalysis was bound to be swallowed up by medicine and psychiatry in particular. And as Freud saw that future shaping up, he felt more and more hostile to the Americans who were trying to make psychoanalysis a respectable profession within medicine, within the money-making medicine that dominated American culture throughout the 20th century. And also this idea of a respectable and restricted sense of the human being that medicine gives. His vision of human beings was a far larger one, captured by novels, by the humanities, far works of art, far more than the bodily and the scientific model, the one-dimensional model, which Freud himself also believed in, which was to be found in American medicine. He believed in his legacy in a very profound way, and his legacy was psychoanalysis. And from early on, that's what he cared about most, having a legacy. And at first he thought his younger pupils, disciples, followers would be his legacy. Then it became a larger cultural movement, and he became a great figure, a cultural figure, like Einstein, like John Maynard Keynes, like Marie Curie. These are the people in the 1920s and 30s that he was linked with as great figureheads of early 20th century culture. He would have been pleased that Bertrand Russell said in 1950, when he was asked the question for Time magazine, the greatest man of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, and Russell said, probably Einstein, but Freud and Lenin come close. So Einstein, Freud, Lenin. Freud would have been pleased to be in this company. That was his legacy, and he knew it by the time he died. But he also knew that his legacy was to be hated. I once talked to a French friend who said his father, the day he heard in Le Figaro in Paris that Freud had died, said, "Hooray! Finally, this dirty old man is dead." I mean, the victory at that moment in September 1939, the victory in the bourgeoisie, that one of the chief enemies of the bourgeoisie had died, was absolutely palpable. And so that was part of the legacy. He was a devil. In fact, Keynes called him a devil, a sort of devil, in a piece he wrote in 1925. So Freud was amused. He was a Faustian figure, he turned out. He didn't know he was going to be that, but he turned out that his legacy was Faustian. It had a double side to it. And there was a deal with the devil, which Freud himself had played with such references that, you know, his work was a kind of deal with the devil. In fact, one of the journals on the history of psychoanalysis calls itself Lucifer Amor. That's because Freud talked about the devil, love, in one of his letters in the 1890s. And this was somehow the agent he was coming to terms with in human history, in human culture. This devil, love, libido, we now call it. That was the interlocutor that Freud was dealing with. He was bound to have a tough time of it if he was dealing with the devil. I think he used to call it resistance, and this has become a word of abuse of the Freudians. They always say any criticism of them, that's just resistance. People resisting their theories because they don't like their theories. And so whenever they object or criticize, that's just resistance. So we don't have to take those objections or criticisms into account. Now, resistance is actually a very neutral, anodyne word. So let's call it dirty secrets instead. So the hatred of Freud is because Freud says everyone has dirty secrets. Not only do they have dirty secrets, but those dirty secrets have a fundamental effect on the course of their lives. In fact, maybe determining for who they are, what they are, how they've become who they are. I mean, there's a a cynical view that every millionaire makes their first 10,000 in a criminal way, no matter how clean thereafter. But the first 10,000 is always criminal. There's a kind of view in Freud, perhaps, that everyone starts off a criminal with their dirty secrets. Now, this cuts two ways. Because you can either say, I don't have any dirty secrets. That's a horrible thing to say about me. And that's why you hate it so much. Or, just as troubling, is my nearest and dearest. My father, my mother, my sister, my brother, my wife, my children. They have dirty secrets. That is equally shocking. Is it worse that I've got dirty secrets or they've got dirty secrets? And with that kind of view of why people hate Freud so much, one begins to see that Freud organizes his view of human beings around idealization and denigration. That's the way people see themselves. They denigrate themselves or they idealize themselves. But if they idealize themselves, they often usually denigrate other people. And it's this axis of denigration and idealization that Freud is talking about all the time. And the concept of ego ideal in psychoanalysis is one formula for talking about it. But it's the way of hating other people because, or despising other people, or despising oneself. That's kind of toing and froing, this dynamic relation that Freud observes and then theorizes. And then people hate that because they don't want to be either denigrated or have to denigrate others. So that's one way of looking at the resistance, the dislike that so many people have for Freud. Freud was a critic of Puritanism, no doubt about that. He was a critic of morality because morality was a vehicle for the sadistic power of the superego. But Freud believed in morality, but he didn't believe in either a religious or any other kind of foundation for morality. He said morality is self-evident. You just know. So he's an intuitive moral theorist, you might say. And you might even say that's not a theory, that's just, you know what's good and what's bad. But then he said, well, morality is actually just a highway code for the regulation of relations between human beings. There's nothing moral about red lights or green lights or driving on the left or driving on the right. Those are just rules. But they're very important rules because if you don't drive on the right side of the road or the left side of the road in the country you're in, you'll end up dead and somebody else will end up dead. So morality is very important if it's like that. It's as important as the highway code. Now the highway code we take for granted. You're a civilized human being in the 21st century, you obey the highway code. And it's a matter of self-preservation and preservation of others. Freud thought morality was just the same. And it's nothing more controversial than that. It's when you get violence and passion associated with morality that things get complicated. And that's the sign of the superego. That's the sign of our inner natures being mobilized against other human beings in the name of morality, for social order, for being right, being on the side of the angels against the devils. We have witch hunts all the time. In fact, more now even perhaps than when Freud was alive. Witch hunts of sex offenders, child abusers, people who committed crimes in their youth and hid them for 40 years. They're all coming out of the woodwork. Not to mention people who commit violent crimes, go to jail for 7 years and then come out. And people are scandalized by this. And passions are aroused. Well, that's what Freud would call morality as, and he did call it that, it's morality as an agent of the unconscious, in which it's used against other people and used in the name of one's own group, one's social group, to the exclusion of others often, and so forth. Well, it's just a plain fact that Freud's work was treated as needing to be restricted to a very small group of people. But the usual suspects, lawyers and doctors, these are the people who are allowed to read Freud because their professional life is bound up with being protected against sex, obscenity, scandal. That's the view. The doctors somehow allowed to see naked bodies, therefore they're allowed to hear about sex. That was true in the 1920s. So Freud was not unusual. What the problem was that he talked about sex for a more general public as well. And that's where the difficulty of the dissemination of his work, of people not wanting to let his books get into the hands of children. But this is an old theme in English life. It was still there in the 1960s with the Lady Chatterley trial, the judge saying to the jury, "Would you like your servant to read this book? Would you feel happy about it?" Well, Freud was in the same category. So D.H. Lawrence, Sigmund Freud, much of a muchness in certain respects in the 1920s. The English prurient Puritanism, which was also to be found in the United States. Freud ran into that, but that just deserves a shrug of the shoulders. That's just life at that time. He was highly respected by the English. Like, as Bertrand Russell's comment, saying Freud was one of the 2 or 3 greatest men of the 20th century, that comment makes it clear that his reputation, even though controversial, was a considerable one. Now things have changed. You see, when I interviewed him, it was partly about him being alive, but he died in 1939. And yet 50, 60, 70 years after his death, people are still fighting over his legacy and fighting over whether or not he is a controversial figure or a figure who can offer us anything now. We even have this bizarre scene a few months ago of burglars breaking into the crematorium where his ashes are. And it looked, not quite clear what happened, it looked as if they wanted to steal his ashes. Or they may have wanted to steal the Greek vase in which his ashes were contained. The burglary went wrong. But the question still remains, were Freud's ashes valuable, or was it the container in which they're to be found valuable? And that's a kind of allegory, in some sense, still, for whether it's Freud himself, his writings, or something that Freud represents, which might be an old-fashioned humanism or a kind of vision of the relations between human beings, which the modern world, the 21st century world, wants to discard, and the psychotherapeutic relationship. Is that what is dangerous about Freud? 2 people alone in a room in which one offers to help the other and the other asks for help in desperation, in depression, in all the difficult things in their lives from the other person. That's what Freud invented as a relationship, and he theorized that relationship. He tried to explore what goes on between 2 people in a quiet room with the door closed in which they talk. Is that very dangerous? Is that where the charlatanry is to be found? Because Freud is accused of being a charlatan. But what is there about two people in a room? One of them pays the other, it's true. But why is that different, say, from this relationship I'm having with you at the moment, in which you're filming me and we're having a conversation in a room, which happens to be the same room as Freud's psychoanalytic conversation went on. Could there be dangerous things that will go on in our conversation? Why is it even worth filming such an event? Are we being charlatans in the same kind of way that psychoanalysis is accused of being charlatanry? Maybe the fact that Freud invented psychoanalysis in 1895, that the cinema was invented in the same year. The movie industry is often called the dream industry. Freud's great contribution was the interpretation of dreams. So we have these two dream industries, one telling your dreams to a stranger, the other seeing dreams on a blank wall in a dark room. These two great dream industries, and how are they connected one with the other? Maybe there is a deep connection to do with the technologies and the social relations of the 20th century. Freud thought that Woody Allen was a very good patient. He explored things, and he made a career out of it. But it's quite clear that his inner explorations went hand in hand with being a very funny man. I mean, what he found through his inner explorations was a ridiculous person, Woody Allen. And he showed it to the rest of the world, and everyone laughed because they recognized themselves, or they recognized this other person they like to despise. So the dynamics of Woody Allen's neurosis was a very good vehicle for the psychoanalytic cure that obviously took place over many, many years for Woody Allen. That was, Woody Allen said, what's one of those great Woody Allen lines? Orthodox Freudians, if you commit suicide, they make you pay for the sessions you've missed. Woody Allen had a clear sense of his relationship with his psychoanalysts, many of them over the years. Yes, it made me think about a passage in Civilization is Discontents where Freud talks about how human beings have discovered a number of palliatives to make life easier, because life is very difficult. And amongst the palliatives is religion. That's consolation. And sometimes the promise of a future life after this miserable one is over. You think you're going to get a good deal in the second coming, the second time round. But then the other one that he talked about was drugs. And he said, never underestimate the power of drugs for human how can I put this out? How does he put it? Never underestimate the power of drugs as consolation. And people never get sick and tired of their drugs in the way they do, for instance, of their sexual partners. Nobody complains about how the whiskey this year is not as good as it was last year, in the same way they might talk about their mistresses or their favourite lovers, their gigolos. Freud actually says this in Civilization is Discontent. So he saw how all-pervasive various forms of consolation are. Sex and drugs and rock and roll is the one that the late 20th century invented. But drink has been there for a long time, and other forms of drug. His famous cigar, he knew very well that was his form of consolation that was necessary for him to find life bearable. No, I'd put one out just before I come in the room. No, I don't smoke cigars.